All metaphysicians are therefore solemnly and legally suspended from their occupation till they shall have answered in a satisfactory manner the question, how are synthetic cognitions a priori possible? For the answer contains which they must show when they have anything to offer in the name of pure reason. But if they do not possess these credentials, they can expect nothing else of reasonable people who have been deceived so often than to be dismissed without further ado. Immanuel Kant. In my last lecture, I gave a general overview of what Kant's critical project is about. I said that since dogmatism, with its blind faith in reason's ability to answer our speculative questions like, is there God, is there an immortal soul, as well as skepticism, with its blind distrust of reason's ability to answer such questions, since both of them fail, what is needed to pass between the cliffs of dogmatism and skepticism, as Kant puts it, what is needed is criticism. Kant says that metaphysics, just like the field of history, since both of them don't work with intuition, with viewing, since both of them lack a common standard by which we can easily judge what is right and what isn't right, both of them first need a critique. A critique where we look what are the sources of our cognition, what is the extension that cognition can have, what are the limits that cognition must have, and where we try to answer this from clear principles. Well, now I want to go more deeply into what Kant's critique of reason is about, what its actual question is that it is trying to answer. And that can be answered through looking at the distinction that Kant came up with between analytical and synthetic judgments. Before going into that distinction, however, let me briefly talk about judgments in general, because this is knowledge that Kant didn't have to explain, knowledge that he could assume his readers back in the 18th century had, but knowledge that can't be assumed people nowadays necessarily have. So the logicians would say that a judgment, I'm here going by the standard judgment, is made up of a subject, that is the thing of which you are making a judgment, an assessment. And then there's a predicate, that is the attribute that you are judging this subject to have or to not have. And finally, there's what's called the copula, that is the connection between the two. That is usually the verb to be. So going with a simple and in the history of philosophy famous example, when I say Socrates is mortal, then I have the subject, Socrates, and through the copula is, I connect the subject with the predicate, mortal. And I'm making the subject, and I'm making the judgment that Socrates is mortal. Now, the logicians would differentiate between various kinds of judgments, according to formal criteria. So, for example, there are affirmative judgments where you are saying that the predicate belongs to the subject, like what I just said when I said Socrates is mortal. And on the other hand, there are, for example, negative judgments. That is when you are saying that the predicate does not belong to the subject. So when I say that, for example, Socrates is not a Roman because he was a Greek. If we abstract from the material of the judgments, when we abstract from the content, and logic does this as it's simply a formal science of the formal laws of thinking, then we could write down a judgment as S, that is subject, is P, that is predicate. That again would be an affirmative judgment. And negative judgments could be written down as S is not P. Now, as you can see, there's a formal difference in the structure of the judgments, even if we abstract from their content. So even if the content amounts to the same, so if I say the affirmative judgment, Socrates is mortal, and if I say the negative judgment, Socrates is not immortal, what I'm stating materially is about the same, but the formal structure of, for example, affirmative and negative judgments is different. Now, Kant discovered a new distinction, and that is between analytic and synthetic judgments. That is a distinction, however, that the logicians hadn't found before, hadn't known about before. And to Kant, that is quite easy to explain, because he says logic is a strictly formal science. You can go back to my lecture on what is philosophy, where I talked about the difference between formal philosophy, that is logic, and material philosophy. And the distinction between analytic and synthetic judgments, however, is not formal, it is material. So I can have an analytic judgment, like, for example, a circle has no edges. And I can have a synthetic judgment, for example, humans are not green. And if I just look at the structure, both can be the same. In this case, both are negative judgments. Both have the structure subject is not predicate. And since that is all we do in logic, looking at the formal structure, the distinction between analytic and synthetic judgments doesn't belong into logic, Kant says, and doesn't matter in logic. Because this distinction is about the material, about the content of the judgment. Analytic judgments, what they are doing is they take a concept and they, well, as their name suggests, they analyze that concept and they look at what concepts are part of that concept which we are analyzing. So, for example, I may think of a circle and I may analyze the concept of a circle and I may realize the circle is round. A circle has no edges. Or I can analyze the concept of a body and can realize a body is extended. A body is three-dimensional, it's spatial. Or I can, I can take the concept of a father and I can realize a father is a male with at least one child. All of these judgments are analytical because I am not really adding anything new to the concept of a circle, of a body, of a father. Rather, I am analyzing what already is contained within that concept. That is why Kant also translates analytic judgments as explaining judgments, because that's what they do. They don't really bring us new knowledge. Rather, they take something which we already know and explain it further, because maybe we don't know it with full clarity. Maybe we know it only unconsciously, and only when we think about it further and analyze it, do we realize what we have unconsciously been thinking when thinking this particular judgment. And this analyzing of concepts therefore can be very important, Kant says, because it brings us clarity. And a large part of what philosophy should do is precisely this. Philosophy, Kant says in metaphysics, large parts of metaphysics should be just analyzing our concepts of, for example, a body, or possibility, or necessity, or being, or non-existence. So metaphysics should analyze what are we even thinking when we think these things. And in practical philosophy and morality, Kant says analytic judgments are even more prominent. Almost all of the science of morality, Kant says, is made up of just analyzing what do we mean when we say good and evil. What do we mean when we say morality? And I mentioned in my lecture on what is metaphysics that the job of philosophy is not really, like, for example, in natural science, to give us new knowledge, but rather it is to bring more clarity into that which we already know. And I gave examples in my lecture, what is science, or in my lecture, what is wisdom, because there with Kant I analyzed these concepts. And everyone probably has some vague concept of what science or what wisdom means, but maybe you never really thought it through. And then when you analyze it, you find that science has to be systematic, that science is about relations, about laws, about being able to explain and thereby predict singular facts. Or maybe when you analyze the concept or the idea of wisdom, you can realize that wisdom is connected to morality. Maybe you never clearly thought about that before, but once you do, you can realize that it's not really possible to imagine a wise villain. That when you imagine someone wise, you always have to imagine someone who is good. So these analytic judgments can be quite important to explain to us further, to make more clear what we already have been thinking. But then what we are more interested in, of course, is synthetic judgments. And these Kant translates as expanding judgments, because that's what they do. They don't just analyze and clarify our already existing knowledge, rather they expand it further. They let us gain new knowledge, because in a synthetic judgment, I am connecting a concept with another concept that it wasn't previously connected with. So an example would be bodies are heavy. When I say bodies are extended, that's analytic, because that's basically the definition of a body. A body is a three-dimensional object. If something has no extension, if it's just, for example, a point in space, then it's not a body. But having weight is not a necessary part of being a body. It is possible to at least imagine a body existing that has a certain expansion, that takes up a certain space, however big or small, but that has not just little weight. I mean, we know bodies that seem to weight almost nothing, like a feather, but no weight at all. So saying that bodies are heavy is therefore a synthetic judgment, because I'm here connecting the concept of a body with the concept of heaviness, of weight, and thereby expanding my knowledge. Or when I say things like ravens are black, that is not necessary. I can't just analyze the concept of a raven and what raven means, and through thinking, through analyzing alone, find the black color in it, but rather I have to expand my knowledge about ravens and find out that they are usually black. And ultimately, the analytic judgments serve the synthetic judgments. We try to become more clear about our concepts, to become more conscious of what we have been thinking, so that we then can use those concepts to better synthesize them with each other. But that is what we actually want to do. Now, this distinction between analytic and synthetic judgments can be paired with another distinction that Kant didn't come up with himself, that already was known before Kant, and that is the distinction between judgments a priori and judgments a posteriori. This distinction I already talked about in my lecture on what is science, so I'm referring back to that, and here I will just repeat very briefly that a priori judgments are judgments that don't use experience. They are judgments out of pure reason, and therefore what they are stating is always necessarily and universally true, while judgments a posteriori are judgments that use experience, and therefore they are always contingent and at best only have generality but not universality. Well, when we pair those two distinctions, one could assume that there are four possible kinds of judgments. In fact, it's only three kinds, Kant says, because starting with the analytic judgments, they are always judgments a priori. There are no analytic judgments a posteriori. They are always judgments a priori. I mean, once again, they explain what we already know. They don't expand our knowledge. But that is exactly what experience does. Experience extends our knowledge. So obviously, they can't be based on experience. They are based only on thinking. When I make the judgment that circles don't have edges, I don't need experience. I don't need to have seen 100 circles to assess that apparently they never have edges. Or when I say that a father is male and has children, I don't need to have met 100 fathers. Like when I say ravens are black, I probably need to have seen a bunch of ravens to come to that judgment. But in this case, it's not that I met a bunch of fathers and they always happened to be male, and so I came to this conclusion, but rather I am just thinking about what the concept father means, and it means a male with children. If he didn't have children, he wouldn't be a parent at all. And if he wasn't male but female, then he would be a mother. Same with the body. Saying a body is extended doesn't need experience of bodies. It just needs an understanding of what a body even is. So analytic judgments, therefore, are always judgments a priori. That doesn't mean, of course, that experience wasn't needed to get this concept at all. Of course, if I had no experience, if I was a being of pure reason, I would probably not even know what a father is. But that's besides the point. Once I have the concept of father, analyzing it and coming to realize that it implies maleness and it implies parenthood, is done completely a priori and without experience. And therefore, you can also note that analytic judgments have those two qualities that all a priori judgments have. They are always necessarily and universally true. I will mention that when studying in university, I had one professor who claimed that there must be analytic judgments a posteriori, and the example he gave was this. So the thing in front of me, this is a tree, or this is a house, this is a dog, and he claimed that this is analytic. It is not, however. It is very clearly a synthetic judgment, because here I am not just explaining what I already know, I am clearly expanding my knowledge. Like if you walk down the street and you walk around a corner, you can't know a priori what will be on the other side of that corner. When you walk around the corner, then you can experience that here there's a tree, or here there's a car, or here there's a dog. And this is not something you can analyze, precisely because it is not necessary, right? A body being extended, or a father being male, or a bachelor being unmarried, or a virgin not having had sex, or a mammal giving milk to its young, those things are necessary. They are part of the definition. But the thing in front of you, being a tree, is certainly not necessary, and this is certainly not part of the definition of what it means to be a thing in front of you. Case in point, the thing in front of me right now, it's not a tree, it's a camera. So clearly, by merely analyzing the concept of a thing in front of me, I can't know whether it's a tree or a camera. I think the reason my professor made this error is that in this judgment, this is a tree, it seems like we don't combine two concepts. Like when I say ravens are black, or all bodies have a weight, I have the concept of raven and of blackness, or of a body and of heaviness, and I combine them. When I say this is a tree, it seems like I only have the concept tree, but I'm not combining it with anything. But that is, of course, wrong. I do have another concept, and that is the concept of this. That is the thing in front of me, that unknown X, so to say. And now I combine it with the concept of tree, or in my case, of camera. And now I come to the judgment, this in front of me is a tree or a camera. Why am I even mentioning this anecdote? Well, two reasons. For one, if my professor made this error, and I mean, he was an old guy who had spent decades dealing with philosophy, and presumably he had read Kant, who states very, very clearly that there are no analytic judgments a posteriori. I mean, this is not a case that's up for interpretation. That's basically what Kant says word for word. If that professor still could make that error, then I foresee other people making that same error, and that I want to prevent. But second, I also mentioned the story to point out what the current state of academic philosophology is, because as I want to add, this professor was by no means my worst professor, quite the opposite. He was one of the best, and still he would make such a basic error, or still he had such a deep misunderstanding of Kant. And then you can imagine how bad the misunderstandings get. When it comes to synthetic judgments, clearly there are synthetic judgments a posteriori. I mean, I basically said that all our judgments from experience, they all expand our knowledge. They are all synthetic. I mean, that is what experience does. It is a synthesis. It combines one thing, one concept, with another concept, and thereby gives me new knowledge. And I would say that probably most judgments that we do in life and in daily life, saying this is a tree, or saying this food tastes good, or saying these keys are not the right keys to open this door, or saying this guy is a dick. Those are synthetic judgments. They expand our knowledge, they combine concepts a posteriori. They are based on experience. They are not necessary, but rather we first had to find out that things are the way we judge them to be now. However, and this is where it gets interesting for Kant, there are also synthetic judgments a priori, where we combine concepts and expand our knowledge, but not based on some experience, but simply out of rational thought. There are some such judgments, Kant says, in natural science. That is in pure natural science. I refer back here to my lecture on what is metaphysics, where I talked about the various fields of science that Kant talks about. In pure natural science, we have some synthetic judgments a priori. For example, when we say everything that happens, every effect needs to have a cause that it was caused by. This is clearly not analytic, because in the concept of something happening, there isn't a concept of a cause. It's not necessary to for saying that something happens, that something is an event, that a change takes place in the world. It is not necessary for that to be the case, that it must have been caused by something. It could have happened completely randomly out of nowhere, and still it would be an event, a change, something that happens. But we do judge that everything that happens needs to be caused by something. We don't really expect to ever experience anything in our lives that is not caused by something. If I know that, I don't know, that I have milk in my fridge, and I open my fridge and I see the milk is gone, I will not assume that out of nowhere and without any reason it suddenly just made pop and was gone. Rather, I will assume that there's a reason that this milk is gone, that, for example, someone opened my fridge and stole it. Or also certain laws of nature, like if I claim to have built a perpetuum mobile, so a machine that moves forever without needing to be recharged with new energy, but that basically moves itself and never stops moving, no one would probably believe me. And I assume that if I made that claim to a physicist, he probably wouldn't try to disprove me. He probably wouldn't be open to looking at my machine and seeing if it is indeed a perpetuum mobile, but he would assume right away that my claim is false, because such a thing just can't be built. But clearly, that is not something he knows from experience, because experience can never show that something is impossible. Experience only shows that so far it hasn't been done, but that doesn't mean that it couldn't possibly be done. And yet still, we a priori are certain that it can't be done because of a synthetic judgment a priori. We are usually quite certain of the natural laws that nothing can be created out of nothing and nothing can be turned into nothing. That no new energy can ever be created and no energy can ever be lost. Energy can just be transformed into other states. Movement can produce heat, or heat can produce electricity, or electricity can produce movement. But the energy can never just be gone. We are certain of that a priori, but not from an analysis, but rather from a synthesis. But another field, and the main example of Kant's, is actually mathematics, because Kant says that mathematics is full of synthetic judgments a priori. It's almost exclusively synthetic judgments a priori. So, for example, in geometry, when you say that a triangle is a shape with 3 angles, okay, that is analytic. But when you say that these angles combined have exactly 180 degrees, you can't analyze that out of a concept of a triangle. When you think what a triangle is, how a triangle is defined, it is simply a shape made up of 3 straight lines with 3 angles. But if it was possible for such a shape to have, say, 200 degrees, so if it was possible to combine 3 straight lines and make 3 angles and that have 200 degrees, then that would still be a triangle, because it would still have 3 angles. That wouldn't contradict the definition of what a triangle is. Of course, it's not possible for it to have 200 degrees, but that clearly is not analytic knowledge, it is synthetic knowledge. Or when I say the shortest connection between 2 points is a straight line. Kant uses this example and he says, well, the mere concept of the shortest connection between 2 points, so what I'm thinking when I think this concept, so what I can analyze out of it, it just includes that it must be a connection between 2 points, and that out of all possible connections there might be between those 2 points, it must be shorter than any other possible one. But that this shortest connection is a straight line, that I can never find out through merely thinking about the concept of the shortest connection. That I can only know through synthesis. And the same holds true for arithmetic. Kant's example is a very simple one. It is 5 plus 7 is equals 12. This is not analytic, he says, because the mere concept of 5 plus 7, if you try to analyze that concept, it only contains that 5 plus 7 must be a number that is the sum of 5 and 7. So that contains and combines 5 and 7. But that this number is 12, you can't find out simply through analyzing what 5 plus 7 means. You can only find that out through actually calculating it. And I mean, mathematics is not just analyzing what we already know, it is truly expanding our knowledge and letting us know new things. And I know that this example of Kant seems to be analytical to many people, and even Kant himself acknowledged this, but that is probably only because in the case of this example, the calculation is so easy. It seems to be analytical because we know right away when someone says 5 plus 7 that the answer is 12. But when I say 593.68 times 591.45 squared, and then the root of that, then you probably don't know the answer immediately. You would first have to calculate or to use the help of a calculator. And this seems to be more than simple analysis. And if you ever try to teach math to small children, starting with elementary school, you will probably find that even such simple calculation as 5 plus 7 is not as simple and seemingly merely analytical to them. But rather they can struggle with it quite a lot, and they probably need some sort of help, like counting on their fingers. I mean, in this case, they would have to, I don't know, include their toes, or counting on objects like their pens or whatever. So they still need to make a synthesis. And it is just that when it comes to simple calculations like those, we have become so used to them that I would say we probably don't truly calculate it anymore when we hear it. We just know the answer in many cases. So we are doing this from memory and not through actual calculations anymore. This whole distinction between analytic and synthetic judgments is incredibly important for metaphysics, or for the critique of reason as used in metaphysics. Because before Kant, this distinction wasn't really done. There was only the distinction of a priori and a posteriori judgments. And it is clear that metaphysics is a science a priori. I mean, the very name says metaphysics. It is beyond nature, so it is beyond the realm of experience. But if all judgments a priori are the same to you, then it appears as if metaphysics works to some degree. Because there are some metaphysical statements that really can be proven, that really everyone can agree on. And since that is the case, there's no reason to not believe that other metaphysical questions that people don't yet agree on, that aren't yet proven, could eventually also be proven. But once you have this distinction between analytic and synthetic judgments, you suddenly realize that all the things that people can agree on in metaphysics are all analytical. So yes, everyone can probably agree that all bodies are extended. But that's just an analytic judgment. I mean, people can agree on that because that is what a body is. That is part of the definition of a body. But not all people can agree that there is a God. And not all people can agree with the proofs for God that have been attempted, because Kant would say all statements of existence are always synthetic. You can't know that something exists simply by analyzing the concept of it. I mean, I can think for as long as I want about God, or about trees, or about unicorns, or about stars. Just thinking about what these concepts means will never lead me to know if they exist or not. That is always a synthetic judgment. So that's why this distinction is important. We can no longer fool ourselves that since we managed to prove some things, we will probably also manage to prove other things. But now we will see all we managed to prove was always analytic. So there is no reason yet to believe that we will also be able to prove synthetic judgments a priori. And with that, the question that the critique of reason has to ask becomes more clear. The critique of reason has to find out how these types of judgments are possible. Where when it comes to analytic judgments, Kant says the answer is quite easy. Analytic judgments are possible according to the principle of contradiction. The principle of contradiction is an old law of logic that has already been known in antiquity. And it basically just states that a thing can't contradict itself. Something can't be A and non-A. For example, it makes no sense to say my t-shirt is red and it is not red, it is blue or green. It can't be both. And before some smartass comes and tells me, of course it can be both, it could have red and green stripes. Yes, but then one stripe would be red and one would be green. The very same part cannot both be red and not red. Just like the very same person cannot be alive and not alive. Of course, at different points in time, the person can die, but in the same moment, the person can't be both. And this law of contradiction lets us make analytic judgments, because I just have to think. When, for example, I want to think of a circle with angles, with corners, then I will realize that this predicate, this attribute, the circle is edgy, the circle is angled, that it contradicts the concept of a circle, because circle means that something is round, something is circular, something is without edges. Or when I try to think of a married bachelor or of a female father, I can realize that this contradicts the very concept, because bachelor means someone who is unmarried, father means a male parent. Kant says that we could also describe the analytic judgments according to another law of logic, and that is the so-called law of identity, which basically just states a thing is identical with itself. A is A, B is B. So when I say something is a house, then it's a house. When I say it's a tree, then it's a tree. And so I can do analytic judgments according to this law. So for example, when I say a body is extended, well, saying something is a body and saying something is an extended thing is really identical, because that is what a body is, an extended thing, and that is what an extended thing is, a body. Or saying this guy is a father, and saying this guy is a male with a child means saying the identical thing. It is one and the same, just expressed in different words. To Kant, it doesn't matter whether you go by the law of identity or by the principle of contradiction, because to him it's basically the same law anyways, just turned around. If A is identical with A, then A cannot be non-A. And if A cannot be non-A, then A must be A. It's one and the same statement ultimately to Kant. However, usually he goes with the principle of contradiction, and that is because the law of identity is more simple. I mean, it's just tautological, right? I say a house is a house, a tree is a tree, a human is a human. It is very obvious to anyone that I am here not extending my knowledge. I am at best explaining my knowledge. I'm stating what I already know. But when it comes to the principle of contradiction, Kant says, this can confuse people more. This can more easily delude people into thinking that their knowledge was expanded. Here Kant criticizes the Leibniz-Wolffian metaphysics of his day, because here other scholars, other thinkers had often tried to expand knowledge through the principle of contradiction. But that, he says, is not possible, and that just means that they don't realize that a concept is not the same as the object of that concept, and that the possibility to think something is not the same as that something in itself being possible. So one example would be the so-called ontological proof for God. I will talk about this in more detail in a much later lecture when I come to Kant's philosophy of religion. But for now, I just say that here they try to prove God by basically using the principle of contradiction and saying that God doesn't exist would contradict itself. Because the argument is, well, if we think of the concept of God and analyze it, what is God? Then he's all-knowing, he's almighty, and so on, and he also exists necessarily. Because everything that is not necessary but contingent needs to be caused by something. For example, it's not necessary that I exist, therefore there must be a reason for me existing. The reason is my parents. They made me. But God cannot have a cause. God is the self-sufficient being. So if God doesn't have a cause that walked him into being, then God's existence must in itself be necessary. And to this, Kant would say that is entirely correct insofar as the concept of God is concerned. So what do we think when we think of God? We indeed think a necessary being. But that doesn't mean that such a necessary being actually exists. It only means that if such a being as God exists, then we can know he is necessary. He is not caused by something else. And if no necessary being exists, then no God exists. But necessity being part of the definition of the idea of God doesn't mean that God himself is necessary. Because once again, a concept is not the same as the object of that concept. So the idea of God is not the same as God himself. And Kant stresses very much that just because it is possible to think something without contradiction, it isn't necessarily true. And this is why he prefers going by the principle of contradiction and not the law of identity when he explains analytic judgments, because he wants people to realize that this principle doesn't lead to synthetic judgments. It is a merely formal principle of logics, and therefore it can't materially extend our knowledge. Of course, it does also play a role in synthetic judgments, Kant says, but only a negative role. That is, a synthetic judgment must also not be contradictory. If something contradicts itself, we can know right away that it must be untrue. But the opposite is not the case. So if something is not in contradiction with itself, that alone is not proof that it is true. That just shows that it might be true. There's no contradiction in saying that mice can become 100 years old. It doesn't contradict the concept of what a mouse is, but it is still untrue. We still know from experience that they become maybe 1 or 2 years old, but certainly not 100. Every synthesis combines two things that previously were not combined. So clearly it's not a contradiction for them to be uncombined. So the principle of contradiction is not enough here. Rather, to combine two things that are not necessarily locked together, what we need is a third in which and through which they are combined. So we need an unknown X, so to say, in which the synthesis can take place. Now, when it comes to synthetic judgments a posteriori, the question what that X is easy to answer. It is experience. When I say, for example, that ravens are black, I have the concept of raven, I have the concept of black, and by itself they are not connected. They don't have anything to do with each other. But in experience, they are connected. I see black ravens, for example. I see objects that at the same time are ravens and are black. And so I can make this synthesis and judge that ravens are black. But then, what about synthetic judgments a priori? What is the unknown X here? Well, this is exactly the question that Kant asks. It is clear that metaphysics is only making judgments a priori. It should also be clear that when, and I talked about this in my lecture on what is metaphysics, when we mainly want to find out about God, about the immortality of the soul, about freedom, we are trying to not just better understand what we mean by these ideas, but rather we are trying to extend our knowledge. We are trying to learn something new. We are trying to learn if these things are real. So we are trying to do synthetic judgments. But it is a strange thing with these synthetic judgments a priori, because all a priori judgments must be necessary. But then a synthetic judgment is connecting two things that were not previously connected. So it seems that their connection is not necessary. Well, here Kant would say that analytic judgments a priori are about what we do think together by necessity, while synthetic judgments a priori are about what we should think together by necessity. but probably don't think together. In other words, you could say that the connection between the two concepts, such a synthetic judgment a priori is connecting, is necessary objectively, but it is not necessarily subjectively. So for us as subjects in our thinking, the connection is not necessary. We first need to make it. But when it comes to the objects, it is a necessary connection. While when it comes to synthetic judgments a posteriori, the connection is not just subjectively not necessary, but even objectively. It is not necessary for these two objects to be connected in this way. It just happens to be this way, but it could also be in another way. Anyways, it is this which is the main question, or basically the only question of Kant's critical project. How are synthetic judgments a priori possible? In other words, what is that unknown X in which we make a connection, a synthesis, a priori, without any experience? And it is clear that all of metaphysics hinges on that question. Once we have answered that question, once we have found that X, then it is easy to answer the question, what can we know? Then we can, no matter what the metaphysical question is, so if someone asks, is there God, is the soul immortal? Then what we would have to do in all of those cases is asking, is that X, which we need, because only in that X we can combine two concepts, do we have that X here? And if, for example, when it comes to God, we lack that X, then we know, without even having to try or without even having to disprove the attempted proofs for God, then we know that synthetic judgments a priori about God are not possible, because we are lacking that X here, which is the condition for all such judgments. It is a great help, and it brings great clarity, says Kant, to come up with the right questions and to summarize different problems, different inquiries by one common question, by one common principle. And therefore I say that even if Kant had only come up with that question, how are synthetic judgments a priori possible, even if he had not answered it himself, but just posed the question, that alone would be enough to consider him one of the most important philosophers ever, because all is dependent on that question. Hopefully it now is clear why it is so silly, and why you don't need to listen when, for example, nowadays someone claims that he came up with a new proof for God, or that he came up with a new disproof for God. You don't have to listen to his proofs for or against God. You rather have to ask him, how are synthetic judgments a priori possible? Because you are trying to make such a judgment right now about God, or about the soul, or about freedom. It doesn't matter. So you first have to justify how you supposed to even be able to do that. And only if you can give a good justification for that, only if you can show us that you do have an X, whatever it is, in which you can combine concepts, only then do we have to listen to your attempted proofs. I will add one more thing to this question of Kant's before I move on. And that is, I want to point out that Kant's question is, how are synthetic judgments a priori possible? Kant is not asking, are synthetic judgments a priori possible? Because that he rightfully takes to be a given. and more or less self-evident. Once again, he says there are such judgments. We make such judgments in mathematics, in pure natural science. So the question is not if they are possible, but how they are possible. And thereby, if we answer that question, then we can know in which cases they are possible and why maybe they work in mathematics but they don't work in metaphysics. Nowadays, the most common response, the most common critique to Kant is not that the answer he gave for how synthetic judgments a priori are possible is a wrong answer. And the most common critique is not that they are possible in another way than the way he described, but rather the most common critique is saying that they are not possible at all. And therefore, we also don't have to ask how they are possible. Now, since there are, however, examples of synthetic judgments a priori, if you want to claim they are not possible, you only really have three things you can do. Either you claim that these judgments are not a priori, they are just a posteriori, or you claim that those judgments are not synthetic, they are in fact analytic, or you claim that these judgments are simply wrong, that they are synthetic judgments a priori, but since such judgments are not possible, those judgments are wrong. And all three of those paths are taken. When it comes to pure natural science, nowadays there is basically the claim that all the judgments there are just synthetic judgments a posteriori. So saying that everything that happens has a cause is taken to be not an a priori judgment, but a judgment taken from experience. I would claim that people don't really believe this. Even the people who claim this, they are just claiming this in general in theoretical discussions. You can claim, I'm not saying they are lying. They believe to be believing in it, but they don't really. You can claim about anything as long as you are sitting, I don't know, at university or having an academic debate. But I would say that in the usual day-to-day life, none of those people assume that they will ever experience anything happening without a cause. When, I don't know, when they hear loud noise, when they hear something crashing, they will probably go in the direction of that noise and see if there was a car accident or something. They will not assume that just suddenly there was a noise for no reason at all and with no cause at all. So we do a priori assume that everything happening has a cause, but still, if you ask many current, even natural scientists, even physicists, they apply the principle of causality in their work, but if you ask them of their theoretical opinion, they will probably claim the position that Hume held, that we only know about causality, that we don't really know that such a thing as causality exists, but rather based on our experience, we only go by likelihood. Since we experienced for 1,000 times that A happened and then B happened, we now say it is likely that B will always happen when A happens, but they will claim that we don't really know that A causes B. Now, when it comes to mathematics, it is very obvious that this is not knowledge a posteriori. This is knowledge a priori. And it is very obvious that mathematical truth is necessary. It can't be any other way. The shortest connection between 2 points can't be anything but a straight line. So here, what people will claim nowadays is that those judgments are not synthetic, they are analytic. Well, I talked about that already in this lecture, and I hope the examples I gave made it evident that no, they are indeed synthetic judgments. And quite frankly, I don't take anyone very seriously who claims that there are no synthetic judgments a priori. It's just very obvious that there are. And by all means, you can disagree with Kant's explanation for how they are possible. You can try to give me another explanation of your own. But you cannot seriously claim that they simply don't exist. And in Kant's own day, that was not even an opinion he really considered or really foresaw, just because it is such a silly opinion. But if it is so silly and so evidently wrong, that only makes the question all the more pressing. Why is it the commonly held position now in academia? Kant's critical method, which I talked about in a previous lecture, demands that I answer that question. I could not be assured of my own position that synthetic judgments a priori are possible if I couldn't explain why to so many people they seem to be not possible. Well, I think it is something that can be explained not so much with Kant himself, but if you go beyond Kant, if you look at Fichte, for example, also at Nietzsche's philosophy in a way, then it becomes quite easy to explain. I would say that the reason people deny synthetic judgments a priori is not theoretical. So it is not that they don't understand it, that they are not convinced by the arguments, but rather it is practical. They don't want such judgments to exist, to be possible. And therefore, they try their very hardest to rationalize and explain them away. They try their very hardest to twist the synthetic judgments a priori that very clearly do exist and very clearly are right judgments into either analytic judgments, which they do in mathematics, or into synthetic judgments a posteriori, which they do in natural science. And they do these brain acrobatics because they don't want there to be synthetic judgments a priori. And why is that? Well, because, as I will talk about more when I come to Kant's moral philosophy, the moral law is such a synthetic judgment a priori. That we have a duty to act in a certain way obviously can't be known a posteriori from experience. Experience can only show us how people act or what effects that has, but experience can never show us that we should act in a certain way. But also, clearly this is not analytical. We can't analyze the concept of an action, for example, and thereby know that we should act in a certain way. But rather, this is a synthetic judgment a priori. So if there are no synthetic judgments a priori, then there is no morality. There is no duty. There is no moral law. There is maybe sympathy and compassion and being nice to each other. There is maybe utilitarianism, so smartly calculating what is the outcome that brings the most happiness and the most good feelings. But there is no actual moral duty. There is no actual good and evil. You can't actually go and say to someone, you have a holy responsibility. It would not just be nice for you to do this and that, but you ought to do that. It is your duty. And if you don't do it, then you are guilty. Then you are evil. Then you are committing a crime. you can't say any of that if there are no synthetic judgments a priori. And I think that is the core of the matter, because many people don't want for this to be something you can say. They deny synthetic judgments a priori because they want to deny having a responsibility. They want to deny having duties. Maybe they still want to be nice and and not act selfish all the time, but they want this to be up to themselves. They want to decide themselves when they feel like being nice and acting like the hero and maybe getting praised for it, and when to rather be selfish and egoistical and feel justified in doing so because there is no actual moral law saying that you should not do that. My deep thanks be to my supporters: Thomas Deuringer, Garnau Klaufen, Benjamin Lehning, Oblomov, Samet Özkilic, Christos Pai, Alexander Reuter, Lisa Rinner, Elif Özün, Yasin Özün, as well as to all others who support me and my Aufklärung course.